who's joining us, and I know there will probably be more to join as we get going, and that's totally fine. Welcome to this evening's webinar on FemTech and data privacy. I say evening because I happen to be in the UK, but I know we have folks joining us literally from every time zone across the globe, and I want to thank you, especially for tuning in at a time that perhaps isn't the most convenient for you. My name is Lindsay Balfour. I am an assistant professor of digital media in the Center for Postdigital Cultures at Coventry University. And I know I speak for many here when I say that over the last several weeks, I felt both paralyzed but also mobilized by recent events in the United States. And I've been struck in particular by the calls around the world for those using menstruation and pregnancy or contraceptive digital tools to delete all tracking apps. As a cultural studies and science and technology studies researcher working in the FemTech space, this webinar has really come about as a result of a series of conversations with those working in the FemTech ecosystem as a way to address this question: should we delete our apps? And also, how can sexual and reproductive rights, along with the data that FemTech tools generate, be protected in an era of heightened surveillance and even fear? So thank you all for being here, for being a part of this important conversation. Thank you especially to all of our speakers tonight, who I will introduce in a few moments, and to Olga Baker, who's provided admin support the entire way on behalf of Coventry University. This session will be recorded, and the link will be provided for those who registered. So that email will be sent to you at a later date. So I am going to share my screen here because I do have a few slides. Perfect. And perhaps Olga, for some reason that's not working, send me a chat, but I think it's working. So our plan for the webinar, the next 2 hours or so will sort of unfold as follows. I will offer just a brief bit of context, and then I will introduce the 4 speakers who will address the question of FemTech and data privacy from a diversity of perspectives, whether as founders, legal experts, or from within quality and accreditation frameworks. Each of us will speak for about 10 minutes, after which all 4 sort of special speakers will discuss a few specific and practical questions about how users of apps can protect themselves and their data. At that point, then we'll open the room up for Q&A. Throughout the webinar, you can enter your questions using the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen. You can also support others' questions and upvote them to ensure that the questions that do get addressed are the most helpful to the most people. Our panelists can also see all of the questions, and they may choose to address those in the Q&A box itself. Just a note, because this is quite a sensitive and divisive issue, please keep the questions respectful, and just would ask you to keep that in mind when you are asking. Let's see, before I turn things over to the speakers, let me provide just a little bit of context on the subject of data protection in FemTech. So for those perhaps unfamiliar with the term, the phrase FemTech was actually coined in 2016 by Ida Tin, the founder of Clue, a digital Danish menstruation application. FemTech then is a portmanteau of feminine and technologies. Go to my next slide here, if I can. Oops. Sorry, everyone. There we go. That refers to the wide range of products designed with women's digital health in mind. FemTech then includes both hardware, such as wearables, embeddable, and even ingestible devices, along with software, for example, digital applications, telehealth, and other web-based platforms. These products are designed to reach a range of women's health needs, including menstruation and ovulation tracking, diet and fitness, sexual health, pleasure and wellness, contraception and maternal health, and less frequently, but still importantly, tools for conditions such as endometriosis, polycystic ovary syndrome, menopause, mental health, and more. FemTech's growth has been more than steady. We might say it's been explosive. In 2016, investments in feminine technologies totaled only $100 million US worldwide. I know that sounds like a lot, but in 2019, just 3 years after the phrase entered our vocabulary, FemTech was valued at almost 19 billion, and it's predicted to be worth 60 billion by 2027. And I think this estimate might even be conservative given the industry's history of outperforming expectations. But it's really been in the last month that FemTech has been both highlighted and also come under fire. On June 24th, the United States Supreme Court officially overturned Roe versus Wade, the landmark 1973 ruling that established a constitutional right to abortion, leaving such matters now up to individual states to decide. Some states already had trigger bans in place in anticipation of the Supreme Court's decision, meaning the prohibition on abortion came into effect immediately at the time of the court's ruling. Many other states are expected to follow suit in the coming weeks, with varying degrees of circumstantial provision if a serious health risk to the mother is present. Several states making no provisions for pregnancies that result from things like rape, intimate partner violence, or incest. Some states, of course, will continue to uphold access to abortion services. Following the decision of the Supreme Court and over the last few weeks, news and social media have been flooded with calls for women to delete their menstruation, ovulation, or pregnancy apps based on the fear that the data generated from these apps will not only be sold to third-party advertisers, but possibly accessed by enforcement agencies or even subpoenaed to prosecute those seeking now outlawed forms of reproductive care. These fears are not unfounded. In December 2018, for instance, London-based charity Privacy International reported that many well-known menstruation apps were regularly sharing user data with social media channels. Of the 36 applications they tested, more than 61% immediately transferred data to Facebook when a user opened the app. This is not just a challenge for startups. Recently, the ovulation app Flow reached a settlement with the Federal Trade Commission after allowing the data accumulated by its almost 100 million users to be shared with third-party companies, including advertisers. But this webinar is not an indictment of data itself. If anything, women's health has long been overlooked in the wider field of medical research, and the data generated from self-reporting apps is crucial in understanding more about the unique and diverse experiences of those who identify as women and use women's health services. In the United States, women of childbearing age were effectively banned from participating in clinical trials for decades, an omission that was only reversed in the 1990s. And a really famous example that I always love to cite is the drug Viagra, which was initially found to alleviate period pain in early trials. But the research into the benefits of Viagra for those who menstruate was dropped once it was also found to help treat erectile dysfunction. And these examples, I think, point to what we often refer to as the gender data gap, something I think we'll hear more about in a little bit. But overall, I think they're important when we think about how data can be incredibly critical, but also weaponized. Let us also be reminded that this isn't just an American problem. Reproductive justice is a global fight, and while recent events have been centered in the United States, the concerns around surveillance and retribution are shared worldwide, and also sadly nothing new. Reproductive rights are under threat in many places, and FemTech has a unique opportunity to provide safe and accessible digital healthcare that is innovative and data secure. The cross-sector and multidisciplinary agency Countdown to 2030, for instance, estimates that 1.3 billion people used mobile health services in 2018. Moreover, the COVID-19 pandemic has exacerbated barriers to access, especially accessing healthcare in traditional settings, and limited access to sexual and reproductive health in particular. The United Nations Population Fund estimated in 2020 that just 6 months of significant health service disruptions could result in 47 million low and middle income women going without contraception, leading to an additional 7 million unintended pregnancies. So I think the consequences are clear, and in the weeks following the decision of the Supreme Court, FemTech apps and other companies rushed to respond to the need for continued access to digital reproductive healthcare, while trying to assure users of safety and data security protocols, many of which, must be noted, had been revised very, very recently. These actions began really in May when faced with the leaked draft hinting that Roe v. Wade would be overturned. Companies began scrambling to update their data protection policies. Flow, as it happens, had already done this as an effect of its FTC fine. Google, which acquired fitness tracker Fitbit in 2019, recently announced that it will automatically delete location data if people visit medical facilities, including abortion clinics. It still, of course, does collect this data. When the ruling first leaked, Google also said it would provide travel benefits for employees seeking abortion care out of state. The company, however, did not respond to requests for comment on whether it would comply with potential law enforcement requests for that data related to users. Other major FemTech providers issued statements on their social media vowing to protect user data, but many users are still understandably unsure about whether or not their search histories, location data, and tracking app information could be used to assist the prosecution of abortion in certain states, or if apps would have choice themselves to withhold customers' personal data if subpoenaed. So where is the balance then? We know that during the pandemic in particular, women turned more than ever to technology for their health needs. And now with the fears around accessing reproductive services in traditional settings, FemTech has an absolutely critical role to play in bringing digital tools to the women who need them most. And so the question we'd really like to pose here is not so much how do we delete our apps, but rather how do we know which apps are data secure, safe, and medically accurate? How can we make sense of these vague and lengthy terms of conditions? Is there a way to know which apps are safer than others? And if data from FemTech is crucial for the advancement of medical research, as well as for responsible innovation, how do we ensure that same data is being safeguarded against data brokerage to third parties and potentially government enforcement agencies, not just in America, but in countries around the world? So this is our task this evening. I'm so pleased and very grateful to welcome four amazing speakers to share their thoughts and their very, very important work on this subject. No doubt they've been extra busy in the last few weeks. So let me say, first of all, thank you so much for being here with us when I know it's been a crazy time. I'm going to introduce all of them to you and then I will turn the floor over. First of all, as senior counsel at Nixon Gwilt Law, Bethany Corbin empowers pioneering FemTech and healthcare innovation companies to achieve their goals with well-crafted legal counsel and strategic guidance. She partners with emerging digital health companies at the forefront of healthcare transformation to ensure they are building robust, scalable, and legally compliant companies ready to lead the industry. Bethany is a certified information privacy professional and is certified in healthcare compliance and healthcare privacy compliance. Her strategic guidance and insights have been featured in top news outlets and publications, including Forbes, Fortune, Vice, Technically, The Hustle, Crunchbase News, and more. Bethany is also the host of the Legally FemTech podcast, which I would encourage you all check out. Next, Dr. Simon Leigh joins us as Director of Research at the Organization for the Review of Care and Health Apps. Simon is a health economist and market access specialist who leads ORCA's scientific research department. Working in academia as well as the pharmaceutical and regulatory industries, his core interests include value demonstration, patient preferences, return on investment, and planning routes to market. To date, Simon has published several studies on optimizing the use of digital health technologies and is a content reviewer for the National Institute for Health and Care Research. Danica Kelly is a health and wellness professional and trained sociocultural scholar in issues around female health and representation. For the past 14 years, she's worked globally focusing on health advancement and knowledge translation in developing economies. Danica has a strong history of leadership excellence in the social innovation space, winning awards and recognition from TELUS and the Future of Good, FemTech Analytics, Alberta Women Entrepreneurs, and more. She is CEO and co-founder of Normative, the world's first female-focused tracking app that helps users discover how hormones impact exercise performance, cycle symptoms, sleep quality, mood, and more. And last but not least, as CEO and co-founder of Maila Health, Dr. Samantha Lattof works to improve maternal and newborn health by bridging research and technology. Dr. Lattof has over 15 years of experience conducting women's health research and driving global health programs and projects. Her research has been used to develop health guidelines and inform policy. She has consulted for the World Health Organization's Network for Improving Quality of Care for Maternal, Newborn, and Child Health, IPES, and LSD Enterprise. Prior to consulting, she worked for the London School of Economics and Political Science, Harvard School of Public Health, and Columbia University. Dr. Lattof earned her PhD at the London School of Economics and Political Science and her Master of Science at Harvard School of Public Health. This is quite an impressive lineup, and one that will certainly help us make sense of a very complicated and very important issue. Thank you all in advance. With that, I will stop sharing and I will hand things over to Bethany to start us off.
Perfect. Thank you so much for Lindsay. So happy to be here today to talk about this really important concept and what we can be doing and what we should be doing with our FemTech apps going forward. So as Lindsay mentioned, I'm Bethany Corbin, Senior Counsel at Nixon Gwilt Law. I've included my email at the bottom of this slide in case you'd like to get in touch with me. You should also feel free to reach out on LinkedIn. I'm very active there and I'm happy to continue the conversation there as well. Because I am a lawyer, I do have to issue my typical standard disclaimer, which is that anything that I say during this webinar today should not be construed as legal advice. It is my own personal opinion, not necessarily the opinion of my firm or its clients. And unless we have a signed engagement letter, I do not have an attorney-client relationship with you. So again, this should be taken as general information and not legal advice. So I'm going to cover a couple of really quick topics in the time that we have, and I'm really happy to expand on any of these in the Q&A and to also hear other perspectives from our other speakers. But I want to talk first about just a general overview of the US data privacy and surveillance landscape. What does that look like? What are the laws that we're talking about that may come into play when we're thinking about FemTech apps? Then I want to talk about understanding the privacy workflows that exist within these FemTech apps. Where might those workflows be enhanced? What might some companies be doing with different types of privacy protections? I'll then mention a couple of ways in which law enforcement can obtain reproductive health data so that we start to understand where these risks really arise within that privacy workflow. And then finally, I'm going to conclude by offering some thoughts on whether or not women should delete their FemTech apps and what we might have to risk if we take that route. So let's look first at the overview of the US privacy and data surveillance laws. So everybody is pretty much familiar, usually in the US, with what is known as HIPAA. That's the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act. And within HIPAA, there's two rules. You have the privacy rule and the security rule. And there's a common misconception among the public that HIPAA governs all health data. So it's not unusual for someone to think that because they're entering health data into a FemTech app, that that data is going to be protected the same way that it would be if you were giving that data to your healthcare provider who is billing insurance. That is not the landscape in which we operate. So the majority of these FemTech apps that are on the market are not considered what we call covered entities or business associates under HIPAA, meaning they're not healthcare providers billing insurance. They aren't healthcare clearinghouses. They aren't health plans, and they're not contracted with to perform services on behalf of those types of entities. What that then means is that HIPAA usually does not apply to the data that you are inputting into your FemTech app. So without that type of protection, that means that there's really no federal privacy protection for the data you're putting into your healthcare app. Interestingly, it also means you could give that same data to your FemTech app that you give to your healthcare provider who bills insurance, not covered by that privacy law of HIPAA under whenever you're giving that data to the FemTech app, but it is covered for your healthcare provider, even though it's the exact same data. So if we don't have a federal protection for these types of FemTech apps, what do we have? We've got state privacy laws. So there are 5 states right now that have implemented state privacy laws, the most robust of which right now is California. And so companies that operate within those states typically have to abide by the privacy laws of those states. So that may offer some type of privacy protection to the health data that you're putting into your FemTech app. In addition, we have the Federal Trade Commission, FTC. What that really does is it makes sure, and this is what Lindsay was talking about before with respect to Flow getting in trouble with the FTC. The FTC is there to make sure that we don't have unfair or deceptive consumer acts or practices. And in practicality, what that means for FemTech apps is that whatever that company says in its privacy policy, kind of that outward facing promissory document to you as a consumer, that's got to be accurate. It's got to be truthful, and it's got to accurately reflect what the company is doing with your data. That's where Flow got in trouble, because the way in which Flow was disclosing the data downstream was directly contradictory to its privacy policy, which said, we're not going to disclose your data downstream. Yet behind the scenes, right, they actually were. So that's where the FTC can come into play, help to regulate that. Ever since the Dobbs decision, there's been an increased push for the FTC to more heavily regulate what's going on in the health app industry. And that's also been a call from some of the other things that have happened in health tech, which I'm happy to talk about separately, but aren't necessarily as related to the abortion landscape. And then finally, contractual obligations. Sometimes companies will agree to heighten security and privacy responsibilities and protections than they might not otherwise have to because of who they're contracting with within the industry. So that's kind of the landscape in which FemTech apps are operating with respect to privacy. So whenever we look at the privacy workflow within these FemTech apps, there's a couple of main mechanisms in which your privacy can, or alternatively may not be, safeguarded. The first is the privacy policy. As I mentioned, this is that outward-facing document that tells you as a consumer how companies are going to use your data. Are they going to disclose it downstream to Facebook, to data brokers? How are they going to collect it? How are they going to store it? Is it going to be stored in the US? Maybe it's stored overseas. All of that information is in that very lengthy, often complicated, not user-friendly privacy policy that nobody reads and clicks, I accept. So for users, even if you're not going to read the whole privacy policy, please at least look at the disclosure section. Make sure that you're comfortable right now with what they're going to do downstream with your data disclosures. The second mechanism we have is really opt-in versus opt-out consent. So in the US, we do not, unlike GDPR, have an opt-in requirement. We have an opt-out structure, which means that you might be signed up for certain data sharing practices, and it's your responsibility as a consumer to go in and proactively opt out of that sharing. One thing that we could be doing as FemTech apps and as leaders in this community is potentially switching over to an opt-in structure that will not be the end all be all, but it's at least a step in the right direction to give consumers a bit more control over those privacy settings. Email and text message consent. Sometimes if your app is emailing you or texting you, they'll have a form that you can complete that will say, yes, I agree to be contacted via text message, via email, right? That's one form in which you have a little bit of control over how your data is going to be disclosed across potentially unsecure channels. And then finally, consents for data sharing, depending on what type of data, what type of app, algorithmic prediction, the purpose of that FemTech product. Sometimes there will be a request for you to consent to share your data downstream. Otherwise, you can, usually say, no, I don't want to share my data. I don't want to share it for marketing purposes, right? There's some consents that are usually built into these apps with respect to data sharing. Happy to talk more about this workflow once we get to the Q&A. So how can law enforcement then access your data? There's several ways in which they can do it. Three common ones. First is with that subpoena or lawful court order. They could go to your FemTech app and request your data. So that's one that everybody is pretty worried about right now. Whenever you see them talking about it in the news, is what's going to happen if a FemTech company gets presented with one of those subpoenas. Do they have to turn the data over? So that's kind of number one question. The second way in which they could get that data is through data brokers. So as I mentioned, some apps, we see this more frequently, usually in the free apps, because selling data downstream to data brokers represents a monetary income stream. So apps that have paid versions usually don't have to rely as heavily on the downstream sharing of data. Not to say they don't do it, because they definitely may do that. There's some apps that do, even though they have paid subscriptions. But by selling the data downstream to a data broker, that data broker can collect a mass of data and sell it to anyone in the public. You could buy it, I could buy it. Law enforcement officials who may otherwise need a subpoena to get that data from that app company itself can go and buy that data from a data broker and get access to that data that way. There was a Vice study recently where somebody went and was able to purchase for about $160 data that showed where somebody came from, what clinic they had visited, where they went afterwards, and you can use those data points to try to reconstruct who that person was. Finally, hackers and cyber criminals. This hasn't gotten a lot of attention yet, but in my opinion, the value of reproductive health data has skyrocketed, especially in those jurisdictions where abortion may be illegal. So hackers and cyber criminals now have more of an incentive than ever to try to hack into these types of FemTech apps and reproductive health companies to get that data, hold it for ransom, not only for the business, right, because that's going to be a huge media issue if it gets out that reproductive health data was leaked, but also for the individual woman herself, who may be extorted individually if that hacker is able to re-identify the data. And the hacker could threaten to turn that data over to law enforcement. So that brings us back to the question that Lindsay was talking about earlier, which is, should we delete these apps? How do we ensure that they're being used responsibly? What can we do? The first thing is to understand what's really at risk. So there's a lot of misconception out there about what these trigger laws and abortion laws that are coming into effect say. There's a lot of fear that the data could be used against the woman herself to prove she had an illegal abortion. If we look at the wording of a lot of the abortion laws on the records today, most of them are not criminalizing women. Most of them are actually criminalizing the providers who offer services or provide the abortions themselves. So the providers bear a lot of risk under these new laws. Not to say that these laws do not exist with respect to criminalizing women for abortions, not to say they're not going to get passed, but right now the majority of the risk is on providers. So that means what you're going to do with your FemTech app, whether or not you're going to use it, delete it, change apps, is an individualized personal decision. You should do so based on the more knowledge that we're getting on the privacy and security of those apps, which my colleagues on this panel are going to talk much more about and in depth. And then finally, I do want to note the risk here of abandoning FemTech. So, you know, if you're not comfortable with your FemTech app, your period tracking app, totally a personal decision with respect to whether or not you delete it. But here's what we risk. We risk losing the diversity of data that we have in these apps right now. We risk the fact that some minority populations, such as, for instance, African Americans or Hispanic women who get abortions in those trigger states much more frequently than Caucasian women, may be the ones who decide not to use these period tracking apps. That means we're training algorithms on less diverse data, which means that the predictions that we get are not going to necessarily be reflective of the entire population. It also means that the data, when it goes downstream to researchers who are conducting long-term women's health research on this type of data, they're not going to have a reflective, diverse population and data samples to look at and to make their decisions based on, which means we might get less diverse and less accurate solutions for women's health long-term. So those are some of the risks here that I would caution against abandoning for FemTech. I am now going to turn it over to Simon.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Bethany. I mean, such a great overview of sort of the FemTech privacy landscape, and already so many really great tips in there. And we're gonna get into those in even more detail in a bit. Yeah, and now we're going to move to some thoughts from Simon, almost in the sense maybe of going backwards a bit to think about what's being done before these apps even get to market. So Simon, looking forward to hearing from you.
Thanks, Lindsay. Thanks, Bethany. Okay, so as I'm going to just talk to you, I'm not going to do slides, we're just going to have a chat, and obviously we're just going to do it this way. So I'm Simon Leigh, I'm the Director of Research at Orca in the UK, and our role basically is to act as a safe place for health apps. We operate by having a group of specialist reviewers who download these technologies every day and then run through a 350-point question set. It's very dull, but it's very methodical and very accurate. They go through and double check data privacy. They check whether there's any evidence that it actually works, and whether it's user friendly, and whether the UX works. So can it be used by people with disabilities in hearing or in sight? And the data privacy is by far the biggest section that we deal with these apps, and there's no two ways about it. And like I said, we've been doing this since 2015, and today we've reviewed about 18,000 health apps going through doing this question set. So we've built up a bit of a knowledge of where the common failures in data privacy are, and where also the common areas for improvement. So today I'm just going to cover in 4 brief sections. Firstly, why we need to be more careful, much more careful about the health apps that we choose up front before we download them. Secondly, how can we ensure or be as certain as possible based on the available information that our data is safe? Thirdly, where do we in fact look for these technologies? Do we do it the old-fashioned way where we just look at user downloads and kind of ratings on the App Store, or do we look elsewhere? And then we're going to give you a case study in FemTech, where we've looked at Orca at FemTech products and seen how data secure they actually are. So we've reviewed 25 of these today all over the past 2 years. So a nice broad mix, of which Flow was one, others are available. And we're just going to give you a bit of a rundown of that. So coming back to the first part of this, why do we need to be more careful about health apps and digital health tech in general? And I think I heard a great saying once, and it resonates with everything, and it's that digital health apps are not washing machines. And that sounds really weird to hear like out loud. It's like, where's he going with this? But it's really simple. It's that because I trust that you can tell me whether a washing machine is good, and I know I trust that I can tell whether a washing machine is good. I put my clothes in dirty and they come out clean. They come out clean, great. If my electricity bill doesn't go through the roof, even better. But because I trust that I can do it, I trust that anybody else could tell me whether this experience good is in fact of any use, and whether it's, you know, whether it's described well and it's fit for purpose. But apps, they're not washing machines. It's really difficult to determine what a good quality health app actually looks like. And if it wasn't so difficult, there wouldn't be a whole industry dedicated to this and a whole regulatory side of this. And the FDA is pushing this now massively. NICE has gone hell for leather on this. Orca have been around for a number of years. We've got Danica in Germany. So there's a big push on this now, and quite rightly so too, because with unrivaled access to these technologies, you can just download them off iOS or Google Play, you know, you click of a finger. You don't always know what you're getting. And I think part of the problem is we've all been faced with that iOS update where it's got the big long list of terms and conditions. And maybe one or two of us may have read it here, given the nature of who's here, but I know I certainly haven't. Scroll to the bottom, yes, 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 I just want the update, click, job done. But this is a health product. It's not like there's a patient information leaflet with it, like you get with Advil or anything else. You can go, oh yeah, these are my risks, data privacy risk, very clear. So we do need to be a little bit more careful. And this is especially so with FemTech products, because by definition, these are collecting quite sensitive data. You know, by and large, this is sensitive data. It's not like you can just say, oh, it's just, you know, any old data. So we do really need to be careful. And I guess when it comes to looking for these technologies, where do we look? And it's a really difficult question to answer, because I think, as rightly said before by Bethany, just because somebody says that they're doing one thing doesn't mean that they're in fact not doing another. And that's the big problem that we face here. It's that information asymmetry. Apps could say that I collect your data and I make sure that if it's in transit, it's using the most secure N3 aggregated methods. I can make sure that if I'm storing it, it's as tight and secure as it can be. I have cyber essentials sorted. I'm informing you of where your data's going. But if none of this actually materializes, it's all just, well, it's all bluster, really. It's rhetoric. So how do we get around this? And the honest answer to that is that it's exceptionally difficult to get around that real world. You have to, unfortunately, trust that the legal system will work, and that in instances of, you know, of failing to meet obligations that people, Flow included, will be found out, and as a result, these will be struck from the record, and we'll be left with an overall safer group. But without going into this too pessimistically and assuming that everybody is going to renege on their promises, because obviously they're not, it's an exception rather than a rule. There are places you can go for these technologies, and naturally I wouldn't be doing my job if I didn't recommend Orca, the Organisation for the Review of Care and Health Apps. Take a look. We have libraries left, right and centre. You can find them all over. And it's just having a look at a few apps that we've reviewed as experts and gone, you know what, there's a big data privacy risk on this. You really want to be careful downloading that. And it's simple things like say, asking questions like, is the data privacy policy immediately available before you download the app, or do you only get it after you've downloaded it? You know, that's a big deal. Once you've already downloaded it, you've given up some of your information as you've downloaded your, I mean, you don't know what it's had access to as well. Often I download apps and I go, why does it want access to my pictures? This is a Sudoku app. And it's like, you know, why is it asking for all this? So it's really important that obviously you use a little bit of common sense in this. It's a bit, well, hold on a minute. Is this within the legitimate interest of the person who's operating this app to then ask for this data? I think that's really key. And unfortunately, it is a value judgment. You've got to look at it as a human and go, yeah, something feels a bit off here. I'm not happy with them accessing my contact list, or, you know, for a FemTech product. It's about obviously making sure there are some clear signals there. So if they're able to dictate to you and let you know that there's a data protection officer and they provided the details of that officer openly, why not send an email? That's what they're there for. Why not ask for more information? That's their job. They're getting paid to do this. So, why not ask for more information? We do it for everything else. So, and this is pretty serious stuff. So why not ask that person what's going on here and ask a bit more information? Looking for things like, where they are storing this data and why. For me, key, why are they asking for certain types of data? I think this is really important. I think going back, we've often had this approach before GDPR in the EU, where I'm based, that we just asked for a bit of everything and then we saw how we could use it afterwards. It was a bit of a fishing expedition, whereas obviously now we need to have a legitimate interest. Why are we asking for this specific piece of data? And if there isn't a really good reason for that, and if it doesn't make sense to you, that should be a red flag as well. We need to make sure that all the data being collected about us isn't just a big harvest, but it's crucial to the function of the technology. And if it isn't crucial to the function, the interactions from, and the recommendations that it may provide, then you've got to question why you're being asked for it in the first place, because you can probably guess where it's going. Now, for me, obviously, we've talked about flow, and we all know what happened there. And that's one of the cases that we reviewed at Orca. So we've done a bit of a case study at Orca where we pulled in for this. We'd reviewed today 18,000 health apps, but we'd only done 25 in kind of period tracking. And that's not because we've just gone, oh, we're just going to do the big things. It's just these are the ones that have took the largest amount of time to gain a following enough that we can say, actually, if we review this, we're going to help a lot of people by doing this. Of the 25 that we reviewed, what we found is that only 5 met the minimum quality criteria that we would then recommend to the NHS to offer to its patients. And I'll jump into this a bit further. So 24 of this 25, as you might expect for period tracking apps, collected sensitive data. That's obvious. That's always going to be the case. But half of these 12 didn't specify any compliance with GDPR. It was just completely negated and skirted around. So straight away, that's a bit of a red flag. And 13 of these, so 54%, when actually assessed against this, demonstrate poor compliance with GDPR. So it's an endemic problem in FemTech for these technologies. Now, quite worryingly as well, of these 24, 87.5%, so 21 of these, allowed the sharing of personal or sensitive health data beyond their app to other systems, with 20 of these, so 95% of these sharing it with third parties upon acceptance of the T's and C's. So 90% of these FemTech apps that we reviewed were sharing this data with third parties. That's a significant number. So in order for you to find those 2.5 apps out of 25 in the haystack that don't do this, quite difficult undertaking. And what's concerning is actually only one of these 25 apps actually just kept the data on the device and just allowed you to just keep your own data. It works just as well with the data on the device. It needs your data to operate it. So why does it need to go elsewhere? And the reason it needed to go elsewhere was because 85% of these apps that offer the data elsewhere did so for the purpose of marketing. 50% of them did so for the purpose of quote unquote research, and 50% for improving developer services. So when you look at the broad offering of the reasons why they're transferring this data, most of it isn't patient-centric. It's marketing and developer services. So why am I giving away my data to help these guys in return? And it's worth pointing out that only 2 of these technologies, just 8%, showed any evidence whatsoever of conformity to best practice certifications like ISO 27001 and Cyber Essentials. So you need to be really careful with these technologies, as Bethany quite rightly pointed out as well, because there's a big risk here if you can't find the ones that are very plain and very explicit about what they're doing. And there's an even bigger risk if we don't have the infrastructure set up to follow up on this and make sure that people are being governed properly and that they are abiding by the rules. I appreciate that I'm pretty much dead on time there. So I'm going to stop there. I'm going to pass on, but naturally, if there are any questions, I'll happily answer them at the end. And thank you.
That's great. Thank you so much, Simon. And yes, definitely, if there are any questions, if you could pop those into the Q&A box. And if there's questions there that you see posed by other people that you would like to see answered, please click on the little thumbs up, and that will sort of bump it up to the top of the list. Simon, it's really reassuring, I think, for folks to know that there are agencies and regulatory bodies that are looking into this sort of on behalf of the user, but much of this responsibility also falls to founders and to creators. And we're going to sort of turn to that side of things now, and we're going to hear from Danica next on sort of what sort of her perspective is as a founder on this issue.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm so excited to be here. And I don't know if anyone else has ever been like, I have a plan for a presentation. And then you hear really smart people say really smart things. And you're like, I have so many things I want to say about that. My plan is out the window. So thank you everyone for having me. I am one of the co-founders of Normative. Normative is a female-focused health tracking platform. And the software we're here kind of to discuss today is the Normative app. And I want to give you a little bit of a background. I want to give you a little bit of an origin story to the how and the why and the who and the what of Normative, because I think it's going to lean into some really interesting observations from Bethany and Dr. Leigh. So Normative was founded by, and I mentioned this to Dr. Balfour right before we got on the call as well, it was founded by two feminist scientists who specialized in female health. And we noticed that even with the highest level of data security clearance we could get in the Canadian context, the health information that we could access did not contextualize female health outcomes within the experience of a female body, which was a mind-blowing problem. And we know that there are massive health inequities across sex and gender that are in part a result of us kind of having a widening gender data gap or a sex data gap, where we continue to track female bodies as small male bodies. Super, super problematic. And so we sat down and not to the level of ORCA, but we reviewed a software and a hardware a week for a year. And we were like, who's out there? What are they doing? How is it going? How are they collecting data? Somebody's got to be addressing this in a meaningful way. And we didn't find that. And so we came into it, my co-founder Renee and we said, okay, I guess we'll do it. We'll be the people who do something about this. How? And so we both specialize in risk from two different perspectives. So I'm a sociocultural scholar, as mentioned earlier. And so a lot of my stuff is around social risk. And really pertinent and poignant to me right out of the gates is we're soliciting sensitive health information and potentially from disenfranchised populations or from minority populations. And so if something were to happen, how do we know we're making it safe for people to do this? And my co-founder, she's an epidemiologist. So she's a big data set risk gal. That is her jam, that is her game. And so we said, from Renee's perspective, how do we manage risk? And it was a fascinating, we had a good fight about it for a couple of months on how we were going to bring in, what questions were we going to ask per Dr. Leigh's point. What did we need to solicit? What did we need to solicit now? And what did we need to solicit for the future? So as an example, our initial download cohort was predominantly fairly affluent white women, cisgendered, doing real well, eumenoric, no known health issues, like just hypothetically on like a social risk evaluation skill, not super risky. But did we, in the looking forward at being representative, did we solicit information around ethnic ancestry as an example, kind of taking a combination of either cultural or racial markers that we know could have an impact on health outcomes? Yes, because even though we don't have the population now, as we grow the population on the software, it's really important that we don't pretend that health outcomes are the same across different socioeconomic classes, different cultural groups, different ethnic groups. So per Dr. Leigh's point, yeah, there is a large amount of solicitation. And we were like, if we're going to ask these really sensitive questions, how do we then protect that information? And the big thing came down to, what are the mechanisms by which we allow information into our data lake? And so the big one that we decided, and I thought this really interesting that Bethany brought this up, we can't email you and we can't text you because we don't know who you are, because that information is only stored on your phone. We do not know you. And it's per the subpoena thing. If we got subpoenaed, that would be totally fine because we don't have that data. We don't know who you are. And that was so crucial to us because we're like, what? This is like a couple of years before this, 2 years ago is when we founded, but right out of the gates, we're like, if we get hacked, worst case, cybercrime happens, how do we make sure that even in the worst case scenario, people's data doesn't end up in the wrong hands? And how do we make sure, even from a geomatics perspective, if we don't have more than 3,000 users in our hub, which is a medically de-identifiable population, we don't pull it. Like, it can't be pulled, it can't be identified, we can't create a cohort out of it, which is fascinating. And so with that in mind, I actually want to touch on something really important, which is data sales, because I will say my normative does data sales. It's super important to our business. It is super important to facilitating the ongoing existence of our company. And we want the data that comes in to not just, this is like a don't burn the field you toil. The information we are gathering is so valuable and so important from a perspective of contextualized, serialized, and actualized hormonal information that it has to go out to work with researchers. That is the whole point of collecting this. If we're just collecting it and holding it, we're doing a disservice to everyone. We are not improving the user experience. We're not improving our algorithms. We're not improving health outcomes. It has to leave. And so that is our business model. But we can't do it unless it is a de-identified cohort. It is a one-way encryption. We can't sell anything that could put you at risk for identification. And that is super, super important. So when you read the terms and conditions, and we have like a lay language summary and our actual summary, when you read it, we say we do not sell personally identifiable information, but we do data sales. And that was really important to us from the outset. And I know that a lot of people don't like data sales, but in order for the software to be accessible to populations and not be super expensive, and for the algorithms to work appropriately, this is how we've gone about it. So it was a decision, and I'm super happy to talk through it. But I thought that as we think about ethical use of data, we need to kind of de-villainize some of these ideas.
That's really, really interesting, Danica. And I think you've touched on a few things that I know are going to come up in the Q&A, at least I hope. Perhaps the idea of data sales, but I want to come back to this notion of what we might call the decentralization of data. And this is something that if you're in the UK, you might be familiar with. This is how they sort of ran COVID tracing, where that data is stored on your phone rather on a kind of centralized server. And thinking through that as one maybe possible avenue for the future of FemTech. But I think your comments are really important and useful when we think about sort of how to balance all of this out, right? Using data for good, versus what are the risks involved. And I know that Dr. Lattof, this is something that you think about too as a researcher and a founder. So really looking forward to your perspective on that and other things as well.
Thanks. I can sympathize. I want to continue this conversation, but I'm going to temporarily shift things once more. I have a similar origin story to Danica's, but instead of talking about that today, Lindsay invited me to speak to the ways in which founders are protecting their users. So as a disclaimer, I'm not a lawyer, but I'm also not speaking on behalf of all FemTech founders. So there are a variety of ways in which FemTech companies are protecting their users. I have an avid interest in this subject, and the personal observations I'm sharing today are based primarily on what I've read in recent articles, companies' Instagram posts, LinkedIn posts, et cetera. So I'm sure there are other good examples of FemTech companies and the ways that they're protecting their users. And if you know of any, feel free to drop it in the Q&A. Privacy and data security occupy my thoughts a lot as a FemTech founder, but also as a FemTech user. I was a user before I was ever a founder. And as I've watched companies navigate the initial fallout of the fall of Roe, I've noticed kind of 4 initial ways that companies are responding. First, we're seeing companies emphasize existing regulations and policies. Second, we're seeing them implementing safety-related features. Third, we're seeing companies raise user awareness. And fourth, which is my least favorite, I'll cover all these, but is companies delaying innovation. I find that one really heartbreaking. So to start, I want to let you all know, when I talk about regulations and policies, I'm talking about not only what might exist at a national level or regional level, but also what exists within the company. So for companies that have reacted or responded by, emphasizing current regulations and policies, this kind of group, it's generally business as usual, though you see them maybe communicating more with users about privacy and security. And these 4 categories, so to say, they're not exclusive. So some companies operate, in multiple bins, so to speak. This group of companies with strong internal policies on privacy and data security include FemTech companies like Drip and Yuki. If you're unfamiliar with them, they offer period tracking, sexual health information, so similar to what we've been talking about. And these apps in particular have valued privacy from the start. They've developed apps that do not collect or sell your data or personal information. Your data remains on your device. If you delete the app, your data disappears. The work I do also fits into this group, and it can be really good for people if privacy is your highest priority. If you have a toddler who drops your phone into the toilet, or you tend to lose your phone, you might not be the best fit for this approach. Maybe you really want to have access to that data, so it's good to have a backup. There's pros and cons to all of these approaches. We've also seen companies, particularly those outside of the US, emphasize the benefits of their legal and regulatory settings. So things you've already heard today, like GDPR in the EU, the period tracking app Clue. They shared information with users about European privacy law and how it's the strictest in the world. And, I get it. I founded a company in Germany, and it is comforting to know that we're operating within a system that has these policies in place. But I also think, is the existence of these internal or external policies enough? So, if some authorities, for instance, couldn't obtain your user data from a company, what happens if they were able to get a subpoena for your phone and have your physical device and access your data in person? How far does a company have to go to guarantee user privacy and safety? And are we moving towards a future where all apps have an emergency bypass, kind of like Yuki? So for those of you unfamiliar with this concept, a Yuki user can have a PIN code to access and keep their data private. And if they enter an emergency code, if someone's forcing them to open the app, then it pulls up a fake screen. So, this can be really helpful. It can be really great. I don't think there is necessarily a one size fits all. With this second category, the companies that have turned to implement new safety features, in general, I've kind of noticed that these companies tend to be companies that were built on business models that maybe were based on selling user data, or companies where privacy and data were not an initial focus. And so we're kind of seeing this group of companies pivot to more prominently address privacy and data security. Some companies encourage users to use VPN. Others are incorporating safety features like end-to-end encryption or anonymous mode into their products for the first time. So that's an example. That's where Flow fits in. For example, they added a new anonymous mode. There was another example I saw in the news about an astrology-based period tracking app called Stardust. I hadn't heard of them before, but they promised end-to-end encryption. And as I went back to check everything today before talking to you, actually articles in TechCrunch and Silicon Republic suggest that's up in the air. So I'll be interested to see how many companies that have promoted these new features will eventually deliver on them. The third category around raising user awareness is, in general, companies where privacy and data security have been perhaps less of a focus, or are still a focus. And one way or the other, they want to more clearly share with users how they use your data. So instead of making users dig through the dense policy privacies, many companies have gone to Instagram and now share how they use your data. And I think that in general, more actively communicating this information to users is a really good start. But based on a quick review of Instagram posts versus privacy policies, it's important to point out that companies may differentiate between how they handle user data and how they handle user health data. So what appears in an Instagram post on privacy and what appears in a privacy policy can be very different. A couple of examples, one from Ovia, they make fertility and pregnancy apps. And so they posted that they do not sell data to data brokers. This statement is not quite the same as we don't sell your data. And then if you eventually navigate to their privacy policy, you see that advertisers, advertising networks, and analytics providers may also store such technologies on your device. So data is eventually making it to advertisers, but through a different channel. And this is the kind of point where, when you read through these privacy policies, it gets a bit more complicated and confusing. Flow, for example, posted on Instagram that, again, users' health data will never be shared with any company but Flow. Again, you visit the privacy policy and you can see which personal data they share with external parties through AppsFlyer, who then partners with Facebook, Google, Apple, et cetera. So, I think it's a good start that companies are trying to share this information proactively beyond the privacy page. I think as an industry, we can do even better on this front. And I'd like to see this information made more easily understandable and accessible. Going back to human subjects research, for instance, before you can get someone to, participate in your study, share their data, you have to very clearly explain what you're doing. You have to make sure that they understand and that they consent to it. And, that's kind of the approach I'd like to see more companies embrace. And finally, delaying innovation, which is both responsible and heartbreaking at the same time. There was an article in The Verge recently that Nicole Wetzman published on how the fall of Roe has impacted researchers. And I don't know if you've caught it, I'll share the link, but basically she spoke with Professor Ben Smar, who's based in California in the USA, and they discussed his research with Oura, which is the wearable device company that makes a smart ring. And 2 months ago, Professor Smar published this research article in which he showed that this smart ring could detect pregnancy before most people actually test, which is very exciting news. And to use his words, could increase the agency of pregnant individuals. And, findings and insights like this one are one of the reasons I love FemTech. He and his team were also looking into the potential of wearable devices to detect miscarriages, and then Roe fell. So now they've taken a step back to assess and reassess the situation. And his direct quote from the article that has really stayed with me is, "Are we building systems that are going to be used to hurt women instead of helping them?" That's pretty chilling. And I think that, his thinking, his actions, he's being very responsible. But this kind of knowledge is so powerful, especially the ability to know of a miscarriage, for instance. I remember the uncertainty every time I was spotting during pregnancy. Am I going to miscarry? Am I not? Or the uncertainty even when I knew I was miscarrying. And to be able to have that kind of modern knowledge and insights about my body would have been incredible. Like, I don't want to see that kind of development sidetracked because of what's happening. I also don't want to see governments, law enforcement agencies, or other, nefarious individuals or crime rings using this knowledge to harm people instead of help them. So I don't have good solutions. Maybe one of you do. But, at the end of the day, I find value in all of these different approaches. I hope and think we'll start to see more companies realize that privacy and data security require constant nurturing and really being more active in adapting to the environment. And I'd really like to see more companies start to actively layer these different kinds of methods to protect users. So just because you do one thing, that's a good start. What can you do next? And if I can throw in a takeaway message, if privacy and data security are important to you as a FemTech user, then get active. So, audit your apps before you download them. Contact the companies if you need more information or clarification about the privacy policy or how your data will be used. But don't stop there, because as we've seen, with the fall of Roe, FemTech companies don't operate in a vacuum. So actively introduce yourself to your politicians, get involved, don't only respond retroactively after a harmful policy is enacted, meet with your elected officials and get them to support policies that advance health and health tech. And so please, this is, I think, something that I'm happy to see more FemTech companies do it. I think there's also a role for users to play in helping us get to this ideal FemTech future. So thanks. And Glad to meet you all.
That's amazing. Thank you so much, Dr. Lattof. I appreciate especially these examples that you've given, and especially this heartbreak of innovation being curtailed, because we know that these tools are so incredibly valuable when used, and created properly. And I also appreciate how you've raised kind of this question of who's ultimately responsible. And I think the answer is everybody, but, we have founders, regulators, the law, GDPR, or the FTC, or is this truly, like a buyer beware scenario? While at the same time recognizing the agency that buyers and consumers have at the same time. So there's so much to talk about here, and all of your thoughts have been so, thought-provoking and helpful and diverse and really interesting ways of framing the issue. And before we move to sort of maybe some Q&A, which is happening, which is great, I want to shift things sort of towards the practical even a little bit more. And I know you've already given some really good sort of tips and things to look out for. But one of the questions that I so often get asked when I tell people I study FemTech, especially now, is, how do I know which apps I can trust? Which ones should I be wary of? So I want to kind of maybe dig into that a little bit deeper and maybe turn it back to you in reverse order, and go back to you, Dr. Lattof, first, because I know that you've written about this and you spoke about this idea of auditing your apps. And I thought maybe you could tell us a little bit more about sort of what that means. What should we be looking for? I think you have a checklist of sorts, I think, right?
I do. When I was pregnant years ago, I just downloaded pregnancy apps recklessly. So I'd, skim through, oh, I don't like the look, delete it. Oh, maybe I didn't find value, delete it. And the one in particular I kept, it just had lengthy questionnaires. So I'm sitting, 20 minutes entering all my data, and then the app would do nothing. And I'm like, wait, you're not using my data to improve the experience for me. Like, what is the point of entering all that information? And eventually I realized I was the product. And then got a bit savvier about how I choose and use apps. And so now I have 5 questions that I use to assess apps. And the first is, what do the 1-star reviews say? So everyone who likes an app, all the 5-star reviews are basically the same. But for the 1-star reviews, you get a pretty clear sense of, does someone dislike it because they don't care for the color palette, or are they raising serious issues with, privacy, data security, et cetera? The second question is, who's behind the app? To me, it's a red flag if you're not willing to stand beside your work. I think if you go to someone's company website or their app website, you need to know who's building and who's behind this. Similarly, the third question, where is the company located? So one of my examples in the Apple App Store, there's an app that has over 10,000, probably 15,000 reviews at this point. If you go to the company's website, no names, a generic Gmail address, I've emailed them, they never responded. I have no idea where the company is located. And that has a ton of impact on how your data will be treated. If it's the US, Germany, Russia, like very different data and privacy policies. So I like to know where the company's based. Fourthly, are privacy and data security key values? I admit I don't always read the full privacy policy. I try. I do attempt to scroll through it, but sometimes I can get a feel based on other things I've seen with the company. For instance, Yuki's founding story and their privacies, company values. Okay, I feel pretty good about without having to skim through everything. And finally, for number 5, can I trust what the app says? So where is the information coming from? Who's writing the articles? Are they upfront when a post or content is sponsored? Who's sponsoring this? Do they reference where they're getting their information from? Are they pulling it from research? Are they referencing random blog posts, or are they not referencing anything at all? So, at the end of the day, if I'm happy with all of those answers, then I feel pretty good about what's on my phone and what I'm sharing information with.
Yeah, that's such great advice. And I think many of those things are things that folks don't often think about. I know I don't, who's behind my app, you know, I've never thought to go look at who the CEO is, if there's a data controller or not, you know. So I think it's great advice, and it's also really practical. Like we can do that, you know, it's possible to do that work. I don't want to put anyone on the spot. I don't know, Danica, if you want to add to that, sort of from your perspective.
Yeah, I think so. I think the first one, and then maybe this is that researcher training. Always look at the sources. Who are they citing on those blog posts? Who are they kind of using to underpin their technology? That'll usually give you a good sense of the rigor underpinning the company. But the other one that I think there are two more that I would add to that. So the first one is mission and vision of the company. What is the company trying to do? What are they trying to accomplish? And the other one is partners. Who do they work with? Are they reputable? Are they not? Are they big Fortune 500 companies that don't really make sense to align with what they're doing, or are more of like a commercial entity? Or is it your government? Is it a big hospital? Is it a big research lab that's super famous in the field that they're trying to have an impact in? And so looking at where their partnerships are and what the objective of the company is will give you some insight into whether or not you're the product, and what kind of the constraints that organization is held to. So because we want to be a research organized platform, we have a ton of constraints that we have to meet just to be eligible to be research partners for people. And that changes what you can expect instead of data privacy and security. So look who they work with, look what they're trying to do, and then look at their sources. Always look at the sources.
The researcher in me loves that too. That's great. Thank you. And maybe we'll flip things then the other way. And I'm going to come to you, Simon, for this. And you talked about this a little bit, but maybe you could say a little bit more sort of from Orca's perspective, and looking at the privacy policies of care and health apps. What are the red flags for you? The things that sort of set off those alarms in terms of data security?
I suppose the biggest one is not actually having a privacy policy, and you'd be amazed at how many technologies actually fall into this bracket. You think I'm joking here, but it's deadly serious. There are so many that they don't even consider it. So you think, you know, that's an immediate red flag, isn't it? If there's no way of documenting exactly what you're doing and what you're not, you can't read the unwritten rules, right? So you need to have it in front of you. So that's the big one. I think the second one is, it's like you say, it's we automatically start kind of getting a bit edgy when we look at who's involved in the app and what they're doing with it. And it's a common sense red flag a lot of the time. It's going, oh, hold on, who's this person? Why are they interested in women's health? Are they obs and gynae? Are they someone who has the relevant expertise to give me the information that actually matters? And although it crosses into the clinical assurance, professional assurance kind of area, it really is important. If the data protection officer or anyone named on the app isn't anyone of really relevance in that area, then it really is a red flag. And I mean, for me, apps, we treat health apps, don't we? Because they're so easy to get. We just go on our phones, download one. If it doesn't work, Dr. Lattof made a point. If it doesn't work, I'll just get another one. But for me, I treat them more like buying a car or finding a surgeon, because I mean, what's more important than your health, right? We put a load of effort into, if we're going to buy a new washing machine, we'll read the reviews, we'll look at what everyone else has said. Looking for a holiday, we'll go look at health apps. We just download them willy-nilly and away we go. So I think if you put a bit of effort in up front, it'll pay dividends in the long run, because you can spot these red flags. And the other obvious ones are, when he says, yes, your data will be shared with third parties, but it's not clear why, which parts of your data, what's the reason for this data? Or if it says it'll be used for research, what research? What's the purpose of the research? Any good research is started with a hypothesis beforehand. It's not a fishing expedition where we take the data and see what we can get around it. So if they said that they're collecting your data for research, there should be a really good question there that they're aiming to address that's very clear and present to you in front, so that you can say, yeah, this makes sense. This is a good question. I'd like to help answer this. If that's not there, it is obviously a big red flag. But for me, it's the policy, really. There isn't one there, run a mile. And if there's one there that isn't very explicit, and if it looks like it's been written to trip people up, because it's overly legalized, or if it's, you can't understand it, same thing, run a mile, because you want something that you can understand and that, the average person can make an informed choice on. If you can't make an informed choice, that's a big risk.
Okay. Wow. And Bethany, I saw you nodding enthusiastically during that first statement that, a lot of these apps don't even have a privacy policy. And I know you have some ideas on sort of red flags as well. And maybe you can comment on that sort of from a legal standpoint, especially sort of maybe in terms of deciphering those legal terms and conditions. What's the kind of language that most of the time we don't understand? What should we be watching out for in that language?
Yeah, it's a great question. So just piggybacking off of what Simon said, right? As a lawyer, I see a lot of companies and startups who come to me and say, I have a privacy policy. I copied it from my competitor. And I'm, that's very concerning. There are a lot of FemTech companies and health tech companies in general that do that, who don't even understand their own data collection, usage, and disclosure practices. So that's risky, not only for the company, if they are, even do have that type of privacy policy, but if it's a copied and pasted one, risky for them because the FTC is going to look at that and say, hey, that's not really how you're using data. So you've got company risk there. And it also precludes consumers from understanding what you're using their data for, how you're doing it downstream and disclosing it. So if you're a company that's building in this FemTech world, one of the things I want to recommend for you is build a data map. In the early stages of your company, even if your product, your app is very simple, build that data map that shows all of the collection, entry, exit points, storage points for data that your app is collecting, using, and disclosing downstream, because that's going to inform the privacy policy that you create and help to make it accurate, not only for your legal risk, but also for your consumers who are wondering how you're able to disclose that data downstream, what you're doing with it. Consumers are going to start asking questions now, especially if they're not understanding these policies. A lot of the policies are written with a lot of legalese, meaning, heretofore, hereafter, herewith, herein, right? All of that is typically unnecessary, superfluous language. What we actually try to do is we try to write for our clients in plain English to make sure that a consumer, lay consumer, can read it and understand the main points of what's happening with their data. So also if you're a FemTech company on that end and you have one of those complex or confusing policies, it might be time to revisit it and just say, hey, how can we simplify this for consumers? So that's something I'd recommend for companies side. If you're a consumer reading through this, one of the things that I do and recommend is kind of stripping out all that superfluous different types of legalese that you see in there and try to read it or replace it, instead of hereafter with, later. Those types of things, kind of mark it up if you need to make sure that you're understanding it. There's a lot of information in those policies. Not all of it is going to be of equal importance to you. What's going to be really important to you as a FemTech consumer is typically going to be, you're already knowing kind of what data they're collecting on you in general, because typically it's, some type of input that you're putting into that app. It's also things, right? Like if it's a web address, kind of your location, that type of stuff. So make sure you know what they're collecting, but in general, you're pretty familiar with that from the app's use. Look at how they're using that data downstream with their business partners. Are they selling it downstream, right? Like Danica, she says, I sell data, but I'm selling it only to researchers. You know what I mean? So the way that she's selling data is likely not going to cause consumers fear compared to somebody else's. Like, yeah, I'm selling this downstream to data brokers. I've got a contract with Facebook, right? They're a business partner. We're selling them all of your data for advertising. And now all of a sudden you're going to get personalized targeted ads. So make sure that you really understand that disclosure section, what it's saying. That's really where I'd focus. If you've only got a limited amount of time and you can't read through every single policy, focus there, because at least you'll get a sense for how that company's using data.
Mm-hmm. That's such a great sort of both sides approach. And, I think this kind of thing, reading through terms and conditions and seeing these red flags is such a challenge, especially in the context of what we're talking about, which is reproductive rights and reproductive justice, right? And the urgency of the need, I think, for a lot of users of these products to access that as quickly as possible. If a woman finds out she's, unexpectedly pregnant and is feeling in crisis because of that, it's less likely she's going to go through and read all of those terms and conditions, right? Which makes it more important that they are accessible and easy to understand. I'm going to ask one more question kind of all of you, and anybody can sort of answer this, and then we'll go to some of the sort of audience Q&A. And if we don't get to all of them, the panelists will get your questions, but if there is a question you really want to see answered, please upvote that so it goes to the top. And the question here is sort of going back to that idea of balance. this is not a data is bad webinar. You know, data is important. We need data. So how can users distinguish between data policies that collect for research and innovation and medical accuracy versus data that's collected for third-party advertising and potentially sharing with other sort of maybe enforcement agencies? How do we know the difference? Anyone, that's for anybody.
I'd love Dr. Leigh's take on this as somebody who's reviewed 18,000 apps.
You know, one thing I will say, just kind of from my perception, is the companies that are being trustworthy and honest with your data are usually going to be the ones who are telling you upfront exactly what they're using that data for. So they might be the ones that have a bit more information in their privacy policies, or specifically lay out in that disclosure section which companies they're giving it to. Or they might have an advertising section that expressly says, hey, we're gonna sell your data downstream to this advertiser. You don't want to do that. Here's where you can opt out, right? Here's the information you can do it, rather than trying to bury those terms all through, kind of scattered throughout the privacy policy, making it harder for the individual to really recognize and understand how they can opt out of that data sharing. So that's kind of one thing. And then the other thing that I've started to see is companies who are engaging in that socially responsible privacy, you know, patient-centric privacy structure. They're also being vocal and advocating it right now kind of on their platforms as well, and adding in like FAQs about how they're using data and that type of stuff. So look, you know, just looking at a platform, at an app, at a website, you can try to start to discern who's being more reputable and honest with data based on the information that they're being forthright with.
Okay, more transparency there, the better. Detail is good. Yeah. Okay.
I'd merit. Sorry, I had to mute you because my kids were asking me something. So it's quite late here in the UK. It's dinner time. So so I apologise, but I mean, I'd mirror Bethany there in that of all the apps that we've seen all the time, you get a pretty good indication. It's usually, if it looks too good to be true, it usually is. If it looks reputable and it looks, this all makes sense. If people are going out of their way, as Danica said, you know, quite rightly, to explain to you what they're doing with your data, why they're doing it, to be upfront and center, and to say, look, we're doing this with your data. This is yours, but this is what we're doing. We're selling it, but we're doing it for this reason. Similarly, if you're selling it, but you're saying, hey, it's adaptive consent, we'll let you know every time you want to sell your data points on, and you can be in charge. There's always worry, isn't there, when things are hidden and when people keep things to themselves. The more information you present up front, usually the better it is. It's like body language, isn't it? You can work this out. The more people are giving up, the more secure they feel, and the more secure you feel as a result. So always beware of black boxes. And I think that's the thing with Orca as well. If you have to go digging for this information to find it, and go down every rabbit hole through the FAQs, get into the app. We've had apps before where we've got part of the privacy policy on the app and part of it on the website, and it's like, well, surely it should all be in one place. So I think that's the thing. It comes back to what I said before. It's that if it feels right, it's probably more likely to be right.
Okay.
Can I add?
Yeah.
Obviously, the information is important, but I think at the end of the day, actions speak louder than words. So if they say they're doing research, are they sharing the findings with their users? Are they publishing the research in academic journals? Or are they just doing research and no one ever knows what research they're doing?
Yeah, absolutely.
Did I jump off Dr. Lattof's point there quickly? We ran a study with a group of people who had sickle cell disease, and they were looking at developing a health app to let people know about their experiences, because it's a largely misunderstood condition. We don't know an awful lot about it, and there's a lot of misconceptions. And when we asked these individuals what would be a facilitator of you sharing your personal health data within an app or other kind of piece of software, chief among it was knowing why it was being collected, basically what was going to be done with it, and being able to evidence this to change, so that when they submitted data, they could see that they had this link to this, led to this improvement, this research, that, you know, this output. I think that it can't be understated, that link from this is your data, but this is what it will do for the community, or this is what we'll do for it, because you'd be amazed at how much that'll do.
Mm-hmm. And I think generally many people are willing to share information for a good cause, right? As long as they know what it is.
If I can hop on that, just
Yeah,
really
please.
quickly. I think that's a great, just from like, there's some interesting comments on like, how do we do this as a business in there, and like, what does it mean for this to be a capitalistic endeavor? But I think this coming from that balance perspective you asked about, I think there is a beautiful opportunity if you are genuinely engaging in research, when you take that back to your user base and you say thank you, and you give them the in-kind for the data that they have provided you with, and you're able to start making improvements to your algorithms and the technology and the quality of life for your users. That is the balance. But if it only ever stays on the inside, that should be a red flag. That should absolutely be a red flag.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay, let's go to some of the Q&A, because there's some really, really great questions here. And the top question, I personally don't know the answer to. So I'm hoping maybe one of you can help me out. It's a question from Michelle, who asks, in terms of FemTech companies, do we have any immediate data on what's happened over the last month with regard to apps being deleted? I'm not sure if any of you have data on that. There's been a lot of talk about it, but do we know in terms of the numbers whether FemTech's sort of taken a hit or not?
From what I've seen, it is in the millions of deinstalls.
Really?
Yeah.
Okay.
But it's a live number, right? I wish somebody had done one of those advocacy things where they just like put up a web page that has the deinstall count on it. That would be super fun. I would watch that.
I mean, the other way to think about that perhaps is that sort of then in the millions that potentially could be now reached by, really positive, supportive, healthy, safe apps. Maybe it's a switch from something that was questionable into hopefully something that is safer. That's the idealist in me. I don't know if anyone else has thoughts on that. Okay, well, I'm a researcher, so I guess that one's on me to go do a bit of a dive into that data set. Scrolling through the questions here. So this is a question for all panelists from Sarah. What are your perspectives on data privacy from medical institutions? And this is actually something on a personal note. I've been putting together an edited collection, and we do have a chapter in that on sort of right to data privacy with electronic medical records. So I think this question's along that line. What are your perspectives on data privacy from medical institutions? How should we think about patients' right to withhold information from healthcare providers?
I'm happy to jump in and kick it off. So I can talk about it from the legal perspective. So usually whenever we're talking about medical institutions, healthcare providers, those are typically entities that are covered by HIPAA. And so they do have that federal privacy protection to the data that patients are providing. HIPAA does have, and the HHS, Department of Health and Human Services, has issued some guidance that talks about permissible and required disclosures under HIPAA. So whenever we're thinking about things like the subpoenas, it is a permissible disclosure for a covered entity or business associate to release data in response to a lawful subpoena or court order. But it's not a required disclosure. So it's up to that healthcare institution, medical institution. So that's kind of what to know if you're a covered entity. With respect to patients' right to withhold information, there's a couple of thoughts there. The one thing is, if it is data that a patient has collected, for instance, on a FemTech app, right, not data that is absolutely necessary for their medical treatment, not something the provider has asked them to collect. There's a lot of questions out there about A, the accuracy of that data, and B, kind of what you do with that data from a healthcare perspective. If you are a provider or a medical institution, does that data hold value? How do you verify that it's accurate? How do you verify it's that person's data? Is that used to actually influence the care treatment plan? What's that going to look like for standard of care in the future? Are providers actually going to be required to incorporate data from these types of healthcare apps? Those are all some pretty broad questions we're dealing with. What I've heard from a lot of providers is right now it's data overload. And so a lot of them would actually prefer not to have the data from those apps because they don't know know how those apps are configured, what those algorithms are doing kind of on the back end. So from the medical perspective, they're not entirely sure how to use that data. So that's kind of one thing to keep in mind if you're a patient thinking about that. The flip side, though, right, is that you may have data that could be relevant to the healthcare treatments that you're seeking, right? Your app may say, oh my gosh, you have XYZ symptoms, right? And your provider doesn't know that, and you want to, have a way to get that information over to your provider. So there are instances, right, in which that data could be relevant for medical care. Ultimately, it's still the patient's decision whether or not they want to share that data. And I think now patients are going to be a bit more hesitant to share that data because once it's in that provider's medical record, it's there, right? It's in your patient history, your patient file. And let's say that you change doctors, right? Your patient file travels with you. So while that one institution you're with might be HIPAA covered entity, their policy may be not to disclose data to law enforcement officers. You switch doctors, you go to a different institution, they may have a different policy. So I think we're going to see on the patient side much more of a tendency to withhold data.
Okay. Yeah, Danica.
I'd love to just add to this from a female-focused health platform perspective. One of the things we've been really careful about. So we're based in Canada, in Alberta, which actually has a unified health system to some extent. And so one of the really exciting things is that if you can build into the system, you can have a broader impact. But much of Canada is not as unified as Alberta is. And so there are lots of different regulatory spaces and different kind of privacy standards and policy standards and data security standards all over the country. And so if you wanted to build a piece of technology, to Bethany's point, that would let you integrate with the data or otherwise, each of those platforms has different privacy security standards to them, and the businesses attached to them can also be quite different. And so when you think about the interoperability as a patient and as a user of a FemTech platform, every time you open up that data portal to another organization through an API, you are risking leakage and some security exposure. And so I think there's a really big ecosystem conversation to be had if we want the data to be managed and clean so that it's useful to our medical practitioners, and also kind of providing larger ideas around agency to our patients and users. There's a broader ecosystem that has to be adjusted to make that safe and usable for stakeholders on both sides.
Okay.
Can I just add on to that as
Please.
well? Sorry. I think from my personal perspective, it all comes down to the reason why we're trying to get this into the EHR as well. I mean, if we look at why we collect most of this data, put simply, it's so that we can have a more evidence-loaded conversation with our clinicians. It's so that when we get that rare interaction that's very hard to achieve and costs a lot of money, when we do get it, we get the absolute most out of it, and that the recommendations that they provide, they do so in a way that's referenced with regard to hard clinical, ideally, or patient-reported outcomes. Now, for me, I'm type 1 diabetic, and I've been for 30 odd years. But whenever I go and see my diabetologist, they don't ask me to API in. They just ask me how I've been, and I show it them on my phone. You won't be able to see this. I bet it's Todd's law. Yeah, it's Todd's law. Can't see it. Let's see if I can turn the brightness down. But basically, it's all just there on my phone. They don't need to have it. They don't need to have a copy of it, but they can still provide me with high quality care just because it's right there. Literally, that's my month. That's my variability. So it's sat there in the palm of my hand, in my control. I can show them. They can have their evidence-loaded conversation. And I remember in the old days, I used to literally print off my readings and show them to my pediatrician. And she'd look at them and go, yeah, that looks about right. And she'd plot them manually. I know we don't have the time that we have now, but why does it need to be in the electronic health record? What added value is it going to provide from being there? Unless it's something that's acute, something like a pacemaker, or something where this may have a grave endpoint. How much difference is it going to make if you're showing it every few months rather than it just being in the EPR? Who's it benefiting? And that'd be my point on that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I'd like to ask one more question from the Q&A, because I think it's a really important one, and it's sort of an aspect that we just maybe a little bit scratched the surface of, but I think it's absolutely critical in terms of when we think about who FemTech is really for, who has access to these digital tools, who is prevented from accessing these digital tools based on all kinds of what we would call sort of intersectional marginalizations, race, class, sexuality, ability, all of these things. And I think it's I'm going to say it, particularly telling when you look at sort of even the demographic of our panel. And I think it is, for better or worse, representative of the FemTech sort of industry as a whole, which is, I think, genuinely trying to make strides to improve health outcomes for traditionally underserved populations. And so that's my lead up to somebody else's question. And so Jennifer, I think, asks a really important question. How is data relative to minority women transferred by these apps, whether it's maybe yours in particular or other apps, to, say, public authorities to improve their health?
I can hop on. So we don't currently transfer your data anywhere. I can only speak for my normative that is not a thing. But I think, and Dr. Leigh touched on this, and Bethany, everybody's talked about this. If it doesn't ask you about your ethnic background or a racialized background, or allow you to, if it doesn't have a sophisticated interaction of those things, it's probably not going to be representative. The other thing to consider, which is fascinating from an iOS perspective, if it creates confidence and for anybody, when we put in the question around ethnic identity and racialized identities, and we also put one around intersex and non-binary, like all sorts of like kind of high risk questions, iOS came back to us and said, you better justify why you're asking people for that information, or we won't let you publish your app. Which is fascinating. So then we had to go back and say, look, these are the research partnerships. This is how we're going to do it. So per the transfer aspect, that doesn't go anywhere. Depending on your business model, it doesn't just like magically float off into other people's hands. But if you aren't asked questions around any sort of ethnic ancestry, haplogroups, whatever it might be, you're not being accounted for in that kind of way, and that's really scary and frustrating.
And I want to hear from the rest of you as well on this issue, but I'm also going to sort of throw in one more aspect of it, because it was just asked as a question, is we're not just talking about data generated from minority women. We could also think about data and inclusive FemTech for say trans and non-binary users who menstruate, and the particular kind of vulnerabilities and risks of that data. I mean, now more than ever as well. Just going to add that to the conversation.
So I'm happy to jump in here a little bit. I have a different perspective, obviously, kind of coming from the legal side, but what I have seen a lot of FemTech apps do is not be inclusive. And it's usually not purposeful, right? It's usually somebody has a certain design assumption during that design creation phase for the app, and they don't vet it through a diverse enough population of users, test users specifically. And so then they're building this product, this platform, right? These visuals that embed certain assumptions. And typically it's, heterosexual, Caucasian, female, as you mentioned, kind of the faces that we're starting to see on these panels. And so that's typically who these apps are built for, not by any type of desire to be exclusive. And it's only once those apps are published and more diverse populations use them that they realize how exclusive those apps are. And so we get what's called an othering of certain populations that are using these FemTech apps. And then what we see, right, is outrage, right? You have LGBTQ users who can't input, for instance, their sexual positions because you're only allowing them to use a banana with a condom, right? That's a certain design assumption here that is exclusive, not intentionally, but that's exclusive of certain experiences that are being had, right? So then you as the company kind of have to go back, redesign your platform, republish it. Whereas if you thought about this beforehand, if you incorporated a much more diverse group of who's going to be your end users at the beginning, it would have prevented some of that, right? Not all of it, because you can't guard against everything, but some of those design assumptions that are exclusive in nature. And we actually have on the Legally FemTech podcast, that's the next topic that we're actually covering, is inclusivity and diversity within FemTech, how to avoid exclusivity in your product design. So for those who are interested, even if it's kind of after the fact, thinking about what language you use, what design assumptions you make, how you actually handle if your app has gone ahead and been exclusive, how do you address that? Right. Please tune into Legally FemTech, because that's actually what we're next addressing.
I I would love to. So as an example of design on that one. So when we started out, we were looking at different ways that you can capture different sex and gender identifying markers. And we read this really great paper on gender spectrums for identity. And so we tried to put it in our very early version, we tried to do a spectrum for gender, but 90% of our population of beta testers were cis white women. And so they've interpreted the gender spectrum as girly girl versus tomboy. Instead of I identify as a man and I identify as a woman, with anything in between or like kind of in combination. And so it's fascinating. So now we have a drop down menu for like cisgender, transgender, gender fluid, all those sorts of things, because the gender spectrum was like way out of the scope for the general population's ability to kind of interact with that out of the gate. So product design is super important.
And it's the research that is needed to go into that product design, hence sort of to sort of bring it back to these questions this is why we need the data, because there is a gap in terms of developing products in a sort of a more inclusive sense, and you can't build what you don't have the information to sort of to base it on. Maybe Bethany, if you have a chance to pop the link for your podcast into we don't have a chat, but into the Q&A, that would be amazing. I know it's really getting late, especially for those of us on sort of this side of the world, although it's a fake background behind me. It's not that sunny. Well, it actually kind of is. But I wanted to give maybe all of you just 1 minute each to sort of, key message or key takeaway before we wrap things up. And maybe I'll start with Simon first.
Thank you. It probably won't come as a surprise to you, because it's what I've been saying all the way throughout, but it's treat these health apps in the worst case scenario. Really take them seriously. They're really easy to get hold of, but they can have quite terrible effects, whether it's data or whether it's even clinical outcomes. So take the time to make sure that you've done your research, and that none of those variety of red flags that all the panelists have suggested today come up, because you'd be amazed how much of the time your instinct is correct. And if something feels off, you're fortunate that you've got thousands of others to go to, and you can go pick another one. And another one, as Dr. Lattof was saying, so it's about making sure it feels right and doing a bit of research up front, because if this is something that you're going to be using for a long time, and that you're trusting with something as important as your health, ultimately, your cycle, you want to make sure that it's correct and that everything's above board and that the right people are on it. So, if it seems too good to be true, it probably is. And, yeah.
Okay. Thanks, Simon. Bethany, I'll come to you next. And I don't think you can actually post that in the Q&A, you're right, but I'll say this actually to all of our panelists: if there's any sort of key links or resources you'd like to share with folks that attended tonight, I will send a follow-up email to everyone who registered, and would be very happy to include those. So yeah, please send me those, as an email after. Bethany, final thoughts.
Yeah, my final thoughts here, right, are really kind of gauge your personal risk tolerance level, while remembering that, right, this is a changing environment. The laws are changing right now. What's in play at this point in time may not be in play tomorrow or 2 months from now. So making sure, right, that whatever you're doing with respect to your apps, you're comfortable with, making sure that you have the tools to make your informed decisions. And my personal perspective, right, is don't put anything out on the internet that you're not comfortable being shared downstream, because you can never 100% safeguard against a hack or a cyber breach, or how that company is going to change its privacy policy and disclose your data downstream. That's the one thing I didn't get a chance to say before, is that privacy policies change. They are living, breathing documents. So what a company does with your data today versus what they do with it 2 months from now, as long as they notify you that they've changed it, are totally acceptable practices. So just make sure anytime you do get kind of those privacy policy has been updated, right? Take another look at that disclosure section. Don't just assume that because things were as a way that you were comfortable with whenever you first signed up, that they're going to stay that way. And we've got more options now as consumers than ever before, more power to demand this type of change with respect to privacy and security. And that's what we need to do so that we don't abandon FemTech entirely.
Yeah, absolutely. I feel like we need to run some kind of TNC's workshop maybe down the road. Danica.
Sure. I think there are some really, I'm just kind of going through the questions to see if there's anything helpful here. And I think I'd like to kind of touch back on some red flags that we didn't talk about before that we've just kind of hit on here. And this is my bias as somebody who worked really, really hard on product development around inclusion. If you open your software and it's hot pink and it assumes you want to get pregnant and it assumes all sorts of weird stuff about you, and it doesn't even give you the ability to terminate a pregnancy. It's like, oh, you're pregnant, now you're here for 9 months, no more insights aside from, know that you can find better tech out there. There are tons of innovators in the space who are intelligent, trained scholars who have come from a really like vetted background on this, who are, per the comments here, working uphill, upstream, up a river like salmon, trying to do something about this. And it's super hard to get funding. It's super hard to get traction. And so if you know somebody who's innovating in the space and they're being really thoughtful about it, support that person, share that information. It is a phenomenal opportunity we're in. And if you open your app and you don't like it, delete it. Just delete it.
Yeah, that's great advice. Yeah, thank you. And Dr. Lattof, final famous last words from you.
Something I probably should have mentioned early on, considering we develop medical device software as a service. When we talk about apps, we need to differentiate between medical device apps and lifestyle apps. So within those categories, there are huge differences. As a medical device company, our apps have to follow a different level of rules and standards, like the ISO standards that Dr. Leigh mentioned. So, there's even within the category of app, we need to be a little bit clear about what we're talking about. But if I have a final takeaway, it's just these data are so valuable, as you all know, and we have, I think, such the potential to have such powerful change that can happen. And I really hope that instead of more people deleting apps, hopefully maybe just switching to something that's more safer, everyone kind of get involved, whether you're a user and you're being more careful in selecting your apps, or you're talking to your politicians, or you're a founder or researcher. Just this is something that all of us, it's important to all of us in the different hats we wear. So I hope to see us come together as a community to address some of these challenges.
Agreed. And I think these are heartbreaking and confusing times for many. And I am very encouraged and inspired that, I feel like this conversation has actually been really positive and hopeful and forward thinking. And I think that's definitely what needs to happen if FemTech is going to sort of be on the front line of this sort of work towards reproductive justice. So I appreciate all of you being here and taking time on a hot day, probably everywhere, wherever you are, and appreciate everybody who tuned in and who stuck with us this far and asked some really, really great and thought-provoking questions. And there's absolutely no way that I can, wrap a bow around this. This is one of many, many conversations to come. And I will be reaching out just via email as a follow-up, maybe with some resources. And I guess I would just say stay tuned, because I think it's important that we keep these conversations, keep them going. So thank you all so much for being here. Please don't hesitate to get in touch with me if you need at any point. And I hope to see you all again at a future event. And yeah, thank you and good night, and stay safe and take care of one another. Thank you.